I'm filthy, inside and out, she said, her voice barely more than breath, scraped raw by shame and exhaustion. The words seemed to hang in the small cabin like smoke that refused to clear. Jonah Hale stood at the foot of the narrow bed, one hand still resting on the blanket, the other clenched as if he might need it to keep himself standing. The lamp on the table cast a warm, unassuming light, the kind that usually softened hard days and long nights. Tonight it did neither. Tonight it revealed truths he was not prepared to see. When he had found her on the edge of his north pasture just before dusk, she had been little more than a shape against the tall grass. At first he'd thought she was a stray calf, tangled in weeds. Then she'd lifted her head, and he'd seen eyes too aware, too haunted, to belong to an animal. She hadn't run when he approached. She hadn't begged either. She'd only said, "Please," and then collapsed. He'd brought her here without thinking twice, muscle memory taking over, the way it did when storms rolled in, or fences broke, or animals were hurt. Help first, questions later. That was how he'd lived most of his 42 years. Now the questions crowded him, pressing in from all sides. She lay rigid on the bed, hands clenched at her sides, staring up at the low ceiling as if it were a judge waiting to pass sentence. Her dark hair was matted, unevenly cut as though someone had hacked at it in anger or desperation. Dirt streaked her temples and jaw. Even after he'd washed her hands and face as gently as he could, the smell of sweat and old fear lingered. "I should go," she said suddenly, panic sharpening her voice. "I shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have touched me." "I'll just easy," Jonah said, holding up a hand, though his heart was pounding. "You're not going anywhere tonight. You can barely sit up. That's not what I mean." Her eyes flicked to his hand on the blanket. "You don't know what's under there." He hesitated. When he'd insisted on checking her injuries, she'd gone very still, every muscle locking as though bracing for a blow. He'd stopped then, told her he wouldn't do anything she didn't agree to. The silence that followed had been heavy, broken only by the wind rattling the windows. Now she swallowed hard. "I'm filthy," she repeated, "inside and out. There's no fixing it. Once you see, you'll know." Jonah had seen plenty in his life: broken bones, torn flesh, animals starved by drought, people hollowed out by loss. He'd buried his wife with his own hands when the ground was too frozen for the town's back. He knew what damage looked like. Still, his fingers trembled as he pulled the blanket back. He froze. It wasn't what he'd expected. Not blood, not gore. It was worse in a quieter way. Bruises, old and new, layered over each other like a cruel map. Yellowing marks fading into purples and blues. Burned scars along her forearm, thin and deliberate. Wrists rubbed raw in places, skin thickened as if by repeated binding. On her ribs, faint lines that might once have been words, now blurred into scars. Jonah felt something crack open in his chest. "Oh," he breathed, the sound torn from him before he could stop it. She flinched, turning her face away, tears leaking into her hair. "I told you." He pulled his hand back as if burned, then forced himself to breathe, slow and steady, the way he did with a spooked horse. "Who did this?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "No one," she said quickly. "Everyone. It doesn't matter. It matters to me." She laughed then, a brittle sound that made his stomach twist. "You don't even know my name. Then tell me," he said softly. A long silence stretched between them. Outside, a coyote yipped, answered by another farther off. The world went on, indifferent. "Mara," she said at last. "My name is Mara." "Well, Mara," Jonah said, pulling up a chair and sitting so they were eye level. "I don't see filth. I see someone who's been hurt, a lot, and who's still breathing." She shook her head. "You didn't see everything. I saw enough," he said, "and I don't scare easy." Her gaze finally met his, searching, wary. Most people do. He believed her. Over the next few days, the ranch settled into a strange new rhythm. Mara slept more than she was awake at first, her body finally claiming the rest it had been denied. Jonah checked her injuries twice a day, asking permission each time, narrating every movement so she wouldn't be startled. He cooked soups and stews, the kind his wife used to make when winter lingered too long. Mara ate cautiously, like someone who didn't trust abundance. She spoke little, but when she did, her words came carefully, as if weighed for danger. She told him fragments, a job that turned into something else, a man who smiled too much, a place she hadn't been allowed to leave, names changed, faces blurred, enough to understand, not enough to relive. "I let it happen," she said once, staring into her bowl. "That's the worst part." Jonah set his spoon down. "No," he said simply, "you don't know that. I know this." He replied, "Someone took choices from you. That doesn't make you guilty. It makes them cruel." She didn't argue, but her shoulders remained tight, as if holding up an invisible weight. The shock he'd felt that first night didn't fade. It transformed. It hardened into something like resolve. Jonah contacted the nearest clinic, then the sheriff he trusted, careful to let Mara decide how much she wanted involved. Some days she wanted justice, other days she wanted only quiet. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, Jonah found her standing on the porch, wrapped in one of his flannel jackets, watching the cattle move slowly across the field. "They don't look afraid," she said. "They're used to this land," he answered. "They know it." "I don't know anything anymore," she said. "I don't even know who I am without all that." Jonah leaned against the railing. "Took me years to figure out who I was after my wife died," he said. "Turned out I wasn't who I thought I was before either." She looked at him, surprised. He hadn't spoken of her before. "You stay alive," he continued. "You do the next right thing you can manage. Eventually you look back and realize you've built something new. Not better, not worse, just yours." Mara's eyes filled, but she didn't look away this time. "What if what's inside me is ruined?" He thought of the night he'd pulled back the blanket, the way his breath had caught, not at her, but at the depth of what she'd endured. "Then we clean," he said. Slowly, patiently, same as you'd do with anything hurt and neglected. She smiled faintly, the expression fragile but real. "You talk like a rancher even about souls." He shrugged. "It's what I know." Weeks passed. Color returned to her face. The bruises faded, though the scars remained. Mara began helping with small chores, feeding the chickens, weeding the garden. She moved carefully, still wary of sudden sounds, but she moved. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she sat beside Jonah on the porch steps. "Do you still think I'm not filthy?" she asked quietly. He considered the question. "I think." He said, "That dirt washes off. Shame can be scraped away. What you are under, all that, that's tougher than you think." She leaned back, letting the last light warm her face. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked almost peaceful. Jonah knew the road ahead would be long. Healing was not a straight line. There would be nights she woke screaming, days she retreated into silence. There would be anger, fear, grief yet to come. But he also knew this. The shock he'd felt that night had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning. A moment of terrible clarity that demanded he choose what kind of man he would be when confronted with another person's pain. As the stars emerged one by one, Mara breathed in deeply, the air smelling of hay and earth and open space. "For the first time," she said, "I don't feel dirty standing still." Jonah said nothing. He didn't need to. The quiet between them was no longer heavy. It was simply there, wide and steady as the land itself, holding both of them as they learned, piece by piece, how to live again,